This is episode 15 of Foreign Object, and I'm your host, CJ Werleman. West Wing is not only my favourite television show of all time, it is arguably the best political drama to ever grace network television. For many Americans, the show gave an illustration of how the three branches of government interact, and in particular, how the executive branch executes the war on terror. In Season 4, President Bartlett's Chief of Staff, as played by the late John Spencer, expresses his frustration with the undefined objective of the US effort to defeat terrorism. He says, "Look, I don't know what winning looks like. What does it look like?" he asked the president, as played by Martin Sheen. "Is it the US flag flying over Mecca? Is that what it's going to take to straighten this out? And if that's the case, well, why are we postponing that? Why are we hoping it's going to happen in the meantime?" It has been nearly a decade since that episode aired and nearly 14 years since the September 11 attacks of New York City and Washington, D.C. and yet both the strategy and the objective of America's effort to defeat jihadi terrorism remains hopelessly undefined. And here's a spoiler alert. The objective and strategy will never be defined because a military solution for a political problem is self-defeating. The endless war has no clear definition of victory unless your definition of victory means the killing of every Muslim terrorist or Muslim freedom fighter on the planet, an impossibility. The war on terror has furthered the spread of failed states. Libya, Yemen and Syria are now in ruins. Iraq hangs on by an ever-diminishing thread. US military actions and failed foreign policy have opened a Pandora's box of new horrors throughout the entire region. It has been said the US suffers from the disease of militarism. Thus, any debate regarding defeating terrorism is confined to the use of military force. The September 11 attacks unleashed worldwide Muslim condemnation of Al-Qaeda and Islamic terrorism. Chris Hedges wrote, "If we had the courage to be vulnerable, to build on this empathy rather than drop explosive ordnance all over the Middle East, we would be safer and more secure today. But we demanded that all kneel before us. We forgot that fighting terrorism is a war of shadows, an intelligence war, not a conventional war." Rula Jebreal is a CNN contributor, award-winning journalist, novelist, and in her most recent piece, Rula implores Europe to learn from America's mistakes. She writes, and I quote, "In formulating an effective response to the Paris terrorist attacks, Europe will need to learn from the United States, both from its failed war on terror and from its shining example of a society that integrates rather than alienates Muslim immigrants." To discuss this more, I have the crazy smart, always insightful Rula here with me now. Rula, welcome to Foreign Object.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, great stuff. Now, in your piece, what really stuck out is what really stood out for me was how you illustrate just how marginalized Muslims in France are, and you illustrated that by asserting that no man by the name of Barack Hussein Obama could ever be elected president in today's France. I guess I'd just like you to speak to that a little bit.
Well, I spent time in France and I lived in Italy for almost 12 years, and it's clear we are worker guests, the so-called worker guests, even though millions of French are Muslims, almost 5 million, and they are third, fourth generation. That means they have no ties where their ancestor homes in former colonies in North Africa, nor they speak Arabic. They never read the Quran. However, they're treated as guests. They're treated as sometimes enemies. They're treated as I think they're basically denied a sense of belonging. Europe sees its future without these communities. For them, they don't exist. And that explains why they are left in degraded realities on the suburbs of Paris, the suburbs of Rome, where, in France, if you think of this data, 10% of the French population are Muslims. 60% of prison populations are Muslim. That means what is left for them as reality, what is left for them to where they live, can produce only criminal outcome, jail, and that can be exploited by jihadists and extremists who actually offer on the other side a sense of belonging to a common identity. And this is the threat, this is the risk. Barack Obama could have never been a president in any European country, not even the UK, because they would have never allowed the system to open up to that extent.
That's an extraordinary. I mean, that really puts into light just how troubled these societies are when it comes to integration. Because you think of Europe as Western social democracies, or enlightened social democracies, and you think about all the problems that America has with race and bigotry, and you're saying that yeah, we can elect a guy by that name here, but in the UK even or France, it's impossible.
But not only that, if you think of inclusion in media, I'm talking also, obviously, I see very clearly the racial tensions in America. However, if you look at the data of African Americans in the media, I mean, the story and the history of Oprah Winfrey, this could never have been replicated in any European country. Apple founder Steve Jobs, who has Syrian ancestors, his father is Syrian heritage. That could never happen in Europe, and this is a tragedy. A former prime minister of Italy read my article and he commented on it, and he said, "It is true. We deny a sense of belonging because we don't see our future as a future of inclusion. That's why Europe rejected Turkey to become a member, rejected that bid for Turkey to become a member, not because Turkey was, violating human rights more than any of these Eastern countries that got included in Europe, but because Turkey has a majority of Muslim population. Europe still today is a Christian white club, and that its identity. They don't want to change it, and they're not willing. Unfortunately, that plays into the hands of Al-Qaeda and ISIS. That's why you have foreign fighters coming from these realities. And if you question why, you have to understand that the answer lies into their segregation and exclusion.
You write that even third-generation French citizens, are treated as invaders.
Yes.
And you're accused of stealing jobs, in which, a lot of immigrants in the United States, they, dealt with the same sort of harsh realities. And you personalize that by saying, so you lived for some time in Italy.
Yes, I lived for 12 years. I was a very successful anchor woman. I rose up to the higher. And two things. My daughter, who's half Italian, Catholic, people still ask her, where are you from? People in Europe, they still ask her, as they ask millions of French Muslims who have no ties whatsoever with their ancestor homes. They still ask them, where are you from? And in that question, there's two things happening. That question, it's a rejection and a way of making them feel excluded and not wanted in that society. Two, that create in a very young mind a kind of, it built up to identity crisis. So if you look at these jihadis that went and are fighting with ISIS, coming from the UK, from Belgium, from France, what they tell you, the majority of them, they tell you that they feel that they are not only marginalized, that they are not wanted. They are guests there, they are working guests, even though they are citizens, but they are not really fully citizens. This is what the French Prime Minister called ghettos, social, economic, and cultural ghettos that are exploited by Al-Qaeda. Europe must address these issues. Otherwise, they will have many Kawachi brothers and many other terrorist attacks in France, in the UK, in Germany, and in Italy.
Yeah, and I guess I've argued this for some time now. It really is just a form of gangsterism. I like to think of them as violent gangs rather than any religious ideology. I mean, if you look at even the worst suburbs in America, you've got black youth unemployment as high as 90 to 95%. Well, the flipping burger jobs don't even exist anymore. The only jobs are to sell drugs and be involved in a gang. Now, if you're coming from if you're an immigrant in France and you're facing unemployment of 50%, then these become, economic opportunities rather than, something which is rooted really in religion. Is that how you see it?
Well, two things. Obviously, there's the path that goes from segregated isolated, harassed suburbs to a criminal life. It's a very short passage. It's easy for them, to be recruited by criminal gangs. But then the passage of, being in prison. What happens in prison? It's a story that we know very well because it's a history repeating itself. If you look at any prison, not only in the West, look at the origin of political Islam. It was born inside Egyptian jails with Sayyid Qutb in the 60s. The father, he gave the manifesto of political Islam, and he wrote this book after he was tortured, humiliated, raped inside Egyptian jails. He wrote Milestone, which is the manifesto of political Islam. And it's the story of every jihadist who was in jail. And inside of jail, there's radicalization going on. If you remember, inside of the Iraqi jails, whether it's Abu Ghraib, Kambuka, what happened inside of those jails, and Americans themselves admit that, jails become a pressure cooker for extremism. So you go inside of jail for petty thefts, whether you're in Pakistan, Afghanistan, or even in the suburb of France. You go out of jail 3 weeks after, ready to blow up yourself. So what happened inside of jail is very relevant in counter-extremism. Inside jail, there's harassment. No doubt in some jails there have been torture and abuse by the system, and that pushed these individuals who are already borderline with crisis of identity to be exploited by extremists that are operating inside of jails. If you look at other side of the societies, when they come out of jail, they have still no jobs and they're excluded, and the society does not want them anymore because not only that they are immigrants or they're brown and they are Muslims, on top of that, they're criminals now. So it's total exclusion. From that journey to go and fight with ISIS or Al-Qaeda in Yemen or in Iraq or in Syria, it's an easy path. So whatever strategy of counter-extremists need to address these issues.
Well, the radicalization of the Kouachi brothers, it follows that exact trajectory, doesn't it? I mean, alienation and dislocation within France, orphaned, life of poverty, and then imprisonment, and then that's where the radicalization, came. Well, radicalization in combination with the U.S.-Iraq war.
Absolutely. But look at every famous jihadist, Bin Laden. Zawahiri was in jail in Egypt. Baghdadi was in jail in Kambuka in Iraq. Zarqawi, Al-Qaeda, the leader of Al-Qaeda in Iraq, he was in jail in Jordan. Behind every jihadist, there is a story of jail and torture. And within that trajectory, you have a journey of radicalization. It's not an excuse for what they are doing, but to deny that there's a link between the history of prison or their story inside of prison and their radicalization is naive.
Well, look, and I mean, this is what befuddles me, and you're a lot closer to television journalism than I am. Why isn't anyone on the cable news networks or even the mainstream networks on television, why don't they call terrorism, why don't they discuss terrorism or the radicalization in its entirety? Why do they focus exclusively on the religious aspect of the terrorists? Why don't they talk about these sort of things?
I think it's a great question, Sai, and it's we have, as intellectual moderates who travel the world, who've seen and who understand the reality on the ground and understand the root causes of the extremism, understand also that we have another fight, and the other fight, another battle. You had that, and I had that, and many others. It's to convince or to say what nobody's saying in not only in political arenas, but in the media. And it's something that most people don't want to talk about because it's easier to talk about, controversy that don't even exist. For example, why Michelle Obama was forced to wear a veil, or while she was in Saudi Arabia, or why Michelle Obama on state television in Saudi Arabia, her face was blurred, which is not true. So you have to fight 3 times harder to get the truth out there to the public opinion. I mean, we live in a country that is the most entertained and the least informed. They know everything about Kim Kardashian, with all due respect. They know nothing about the war on terror that is draining not only public budget,
Yeah.
it's draining actually our civil liberties. And
Well,
it's really disheartening that the focus today in the media, whether it's the weather or some kind of, orchestrated fight between the White House and Boehner, who cares about that, with all due respect? Let's talk about core issues that will affect our lives and our kids' lives.
exactly. I mean, that's, it's that's I find that increasingly, frustrating. You listen, you're watching television news, and even when you're talking about the Jordanian pilot who was brutally and sadistically killed today,
Yes.
now we'll focus, the media, the cable news now will focus exclusively on the brutality of ISIS, which, is inexcusable brutality. That goes without saying. That's obvious. You don't need to be a brain surgeon to figure that out. But there'll be nothing that is said on the other side of that equation, that now Jordan is about to match the brutality of ISIS by executing the ISIS prisoners that they have in their jail cells, which is exactly what ISIS wants them to do. And
Yeah.
we're also not told the complete story that the female Jordanian bomber, the Jordanian wedding bomber whose suicide vest didn't go off, well, she has a story to tell too. And her story is her two brothers and her first husband were killed by the U.S. military in the Iraq invasion. But the media likes to pretend these, Islamic extremists were created in some sort of vacuum, completely and entirely radicalized by a reading of a Quran or by some radical imam somewhere.
This is what really most frustrating to me, and I'm sure to you and to many others. Exactly, the fact that we're talking about these issues as if these extremists woke up one morning and decide to go and do what they are doing. There's a history there, and there's a history that's well documented and well, backed with serious evidence. And that history, starts in the 70s, late 70s, when the invasion of Afghanistan, with backing of the Mujahideen, Western backing of the Mujahideen, that gave birth to Al Qaeda. Nobody mentioned that, but we don't even mention our policies and the monstrous policies of backing dictators like Sisi, who will produce more extremism. I mean, today we have 40,000 prisoners inside Egyptian jails. Do you think they will come out and they will be Nelson Mandela? They will come out and they will be the next Baghdadis and Zawahiris and others. I mean, we need to ask these questions. So when we approve $1.3 billion to the Egyptian military as aid, we have to understand that we are viewed in the eyes of the Egyptians as supporter of an oppressive dictators. We did the same with many other dictators. I'm happy to mention even the Iraqi dictators, whether it's Maliki and before Maliki, Saddam Hussein. And we've been doing this around for a while. It's time to stop and examine our policy and find a vision that goes beyond terror and tyrant. Otherwise, we're losing this war.
Yeah, and coming back to, I mean, you can also add to the fact that we were also arming and funding the Sunni militia at one stage, which ended up being ISIS. So, to offset against Iranian influence in Iraq. So everything sort of comes back full circle. But coming back to France, I mean, what do you believe are the? You say here, defeating terrorism requires that alternative paths to be made available to the many angry young men and women in Europe's immigrant communities. So what are those alternative paths? How can governments, Western governments, particularly in Europe and the UK, what policies or measures can they put in place to combat this, feeling of dislocation, alienation, and harassment?
Well, first of all, live up to your own values. I mean, the French major principles and value, liberté, fraternité, and égalité, which is equality, liberty, and fraternity. I mean, these are French values. They didn't talk about white Christian equality that exclude the rest. Plus, Europe has already a history, a very dark history of mistreating of minorities. And that was not a religious base. That was actually a nationalistic base. So we already saw where did that lead to, and what did that produce with the Holocaust and other things. So isn't it time to learn from that history and open the door for more inclusion? Meaning, do what what American did with African Americans. Look, Selma wasn't 60 years ago. It was some years ago. It was the 60s in this country, and the country moved forward, opening the doors with a huge pushback from many that didn't want to include African Americans in the system. But today they are included, and they have a voice that is loud and well heard. It's the same thing. Europe needs to do the same thing and needs to invest more in integration, meaning since the European Parliament and the French Parliament, I think, put a budget of 500 million euros to combat ISIS, I would love to see even 2% of that budget for education, inclusion of immigrants, actually not immigrants, they are French citizens, they are minority, within the system. Meaning, if you want to combat terrorism and really are serious about it, you have to engage with communities. You have to go to these communities and create partnership.
Instead, though, in the US and even in the UK, is they're infiltrating communities rather than outreaching to communities.
That's how you alienate communities. That's how it's easier for them. I mean, who's the first group that can report about alienation and can report about radicalization? The same communities. They see their kids. They see if they become radicalized. They see what they watch on the internet, their discourse, and what they're talking about. And they can report about that if they are really viewed as an asset by the system, not as something else, as fifth columnist or something else. I remember the Christmas bomber. He was a Nigerian student, radicalized by Al-Awaliki through internet, trained in Yemen, and he board a flight, I think, somewhere in Europe to fight America. Who is the first person that reported on him? That was his father. His father, who was a Nigerian head of central bank, he called the CIA and told the CIA, and they did not believe him. Said, my son is radicalized. My son is about to do something very terrible. Please watch him. That was the father. So you need these figures, but then you need to believe them and include them and treat them better.
But the trend in Europe is not heading that way, is it? I mean,
Absolutely not.
You've got the rise of right-wing political parties and Pegida, which is a real concern. Absolutely.
Look at Marine Le Pen in France, and I mean, her popularity is up to 30%. The New York Times is giving her room even to write an op-ed about her hideous views. And that will play into the hands of Al-Qaeda. What does Al-Qaeda want? And not only Al-Qaeda, they want to polarize and radicalize, meaning dividing the society, hitting hard. And when the minorities are excluded, marginalized, are segregated, then it's easier for Al-Qaeda to infiltrate them and to actually radicalize them and recruit whoever they want to recruit. It becomes easier. And this is what we need to avoid.
Yeah, and I mean, also too, I mean, if you take it across to your former, your country, you're born in Israel, and you wrote a really, incredible piece in your recent return there, and where was I going with that point? So within Israel itself, I mean, they've gone so far to the right wing that they're oppressing that population, where you really have apartheid system there. Well, that seems to be that the model which is going to be taken into the US and into Europe is heavy surveillance, heavy counterterrorism, heavy policing, rather than integration, rather than community outreach and that type of thing. So it seems.
I lived it all my life. When you're viewed as an outsider, as denied a sense of belonging, the biggest crime that you can commit against any community is to deny them a sense of belonging. And it's clear when you go to Israel and you're brown and Arab and a Muslim or Christian even, you are not wanted there. They don't want you. If you're a Jew, and you're a native eventually, but it's just they transmit that to you on daily basis. You're not, this is not your country, not your land. You're not wanted there. We tolerate, some of you because we had to, we gave you citizenship, but however, you're not wanted there. And now it's becoming an institutionalized by law. And this is a scary when you then uphold the supremacy of one ethnic group above another, and you consider the others not only beneath you, inferior to you, then that opens the road for all kind of harassment and open the door for all kind of bullying and crimes.
Well,
crimes become legalized.
This is what I fear, that Europe and the UK and the US are going to be inspired or motivated by the Israeli model, because they look at Israel and they go, okay, we've put the Palestinians either in a cage or we've put a massive big wall around them on the West Bank, and that's lowered the incidence of what they call terrorism against them, or violence, and they think that becomes the model,
Well, they can't. I'll tell you why. In Europe, there's 30 million Muslims, and Europe is becoming, an open because of Schengen, and it's like you have no borders. So the only way is to shut down your borders and have your atomic bomb ready. And in 21st century, you can't do that. If you want trade, if you want to continue being part of the global community, if you want globalization to be beneficiary to you, then you have to find an alternative model. Israel can manage because of the aid that they receive from the US and from Jewish community around the world. They can live in isolated reality for a while, but it will not even work there. Look at their borders. On the north, you have Hezbollah. In the south, you have Hamas. You have a civil war with Syria, inside Syria, with the rise of ISIS. You have Egypt and the Sinai, and you have Al-Qaeda there. Under any scenario, this is a bad situation. Plus, you have your own population, 20% of them who are alienated, and you're occupying another 3-point-something million. What scenario? I mean, if I was a prime minister of Israel and I look at what's happening around me and at home, I would be horrified and terrified. I wouldn't sleep at night. But what they're relying on is superiority in technology and other things, and they're policing. This might work for a while. But look at history. Did it work anywhere else?
No.
It doesn't.
No. And when you illustrated just what you're talking about just in that one example you give in that New York Times piece you wrote, and you said when you and your husband and your daughter, you arrived at Ben Gurion Airport, and your husband just walks straight on through. He's not harassed, but because you're an Arab, you and your daughter were subjected to a strip search.
Every time. It's the most humiliating experience I ever witnessed in my life when I go back home. And I don't sleep 3 days before, and usually I don't sleep 3 days after. It's just they're trying to break the person who's simply love to go back home and visit their families, and I just feel that country is your country as well. It belongs, I was born there, and my family's been there since before the establishment of the State of Israel. However, I'm denied a sense of homeland and a belonging, and I am the most Western, the most. I don't understand what kind of threat do I or my daughter, or my family, or even many Palestinians like myself represent to the State of Israel, except I see that they see in our ethnicity a threat. Our threat lies in the fact that we belong to a different faith and different ethnic group. And when you think along those terms, it's the same way that Assad is thinking. He's thinking that his ethnicity, because he is, and his faith, because he's Alawite, he's superior to the Sunnis. Saddam Hussein used to think the same. And look where did they end up. And you can't uphold the superiority of your ethnic group or religious group above others. We have to find a formula where actually there's a social contract where everybody's it's included.
So what do you think of Western liberal intellectuals, elites like Sam Harris or Bill Maher call for or support racial profiling? And I know you were on Bill Maher's show towards the end of last year, and that was a firecracker of a episode between you and Mayor. So when you hear even liberals calling for those type of draconian policies, what does that make you think?
Well, I think Sam Harris called also for torture. I mean, he was fine with killing of people that don't think, killing of not only Islamists. I don't think he was referring even to Islamists like Hamas, even moderate Islamists. For him, Al-Nahda party, the one in Tunisia, or even the Muslim Brotherhood, who were elected in a free election in Egypt, they're terrorists and they deserve to be killed, and you can take them out. He supports the occupation, like Bill Maher. They support the Israeli occupation of the West Bank. It's the same mentality. Look, these people are actually playing into the hands of Al-Qaeda without knowing it, out of ignorance, but out of ideology. It's that contraposition in ideology that actually plays into the hands of Al-Qaeda. This is what Al-Qaeda wants. This is the best dream, is to have these reactionary people telling minorities around the world, look, we don't trust you. You're not Muslims. You're not moderate Muslims. You're actually Muslims. You're defending a faith that, and in the name of that faith, these people are killing and slaughtering and harassing. Muslims actually the first victim of terrorism today, as we saw with what happened in whether it's in Syria, it's in Iraq, and elsewhere. But the basic point that it's disturbing to me, they don't understand that by polarizing societies, alienating them against their own communities, which is the Muslims living among us, they are making the work of Al-Qaeda so easy. They're playing into that strategy. Two, they don't understand that there's a Wahhabi sect that try to impose their views of Islam on every other Muslims. So for that sect, I am the enemy as a moderate Muslims, as Bill Maher is the enemy. And they're willing to kill both of us. The difference between Bill Maher and I is I would fight those sects because I don't think their version of Islam is the Islam I want to believe in. And I think they consider me kafir, infidel, and they consider Bill Maher infidel. I would defend him in that battle against these groups, but I think he view every moderate as part of that group, even when they don't belong to that group, which is basically ignorant more than anything else.
Well, and that's funny because you're a Muslim, yet Bill Maher is an atheist. But he reads the Quran in an interpretation more aligned with ISIS than you, and it's like it's this it's a symbiotic relationship. ISIS and someone like Bill Maher, they can't a Western elite like Bill Maher, they can't exist without the other, because ISIS says the West is at war. They use their propaganda saying the West is at war with Islam, and then you have someone like Bill Maher saying we're at war with Islam. So it just validates.
Absolutely. And they remember what Zawahiri was mocking the Muslim Brotherhood, said, why you believe in democracy? They will never let you govern. Join us, because the only real path to change reality is through violence. And the Muslim Brotherhood told him, no, we believe in a democratic system where we vote, where we actually appeal to the people based on our principles and strategies and other things. They governed very badly, but at least they didn't embrace violence. What Bill Maher is doing, saying to all the Muslim Brotherhood, you're all alike, you and Zawahiri are alike, I don't believe you. And it just actually, what he's doing is so reckless and dangerous, because he's saying that the alternative to those people are Sisi, which is this tyrant and despot. He doesn't understand the connection. Tyrant gave us terrorism that opened the door for Western invasions. This is a cycle that needs to be interrupted. Otherwise, we go to square zero, not Tahrir Square, square zero. And we will be engaged in this war forever. I remember when I was on Bill Maher after the show, we were talking about Sisi, the president of Egypt, and he said, well, we need Sisi because he keeps the Muslim Brotherhood on check. And I said, no, Sisi is the guy that will give you the next Bin Laden. Yeah. So beware.
Exactly. And forgetting that it was a secular uprising which started the Arab Spring. I mean, we should be helping and helping the secularists form, a government. But to say something like that is just, supporting these autocratic regimes is what creates, and you've articulated that well with, with Egypt and Saudi Arabia and so forth. I mean, it's just totally counterproductive.
But also to say, if I may just add one thing, it's also to say that every violence just inherently violent, Islam is inherently violent. I'm sorry, atheism was inherently violent and still inherently violent. Look at how many, in the name of atheism, were killed. Mao, how many people, when he invaded Cambodia, when he invaded Tibet, what did he say to Dalai Lama?
Yeah, religion is evil.
Religion is evil. Yeah. This is what Bill Maher is saying. This is what Sam Harris is saying. When Karl Marx said religion is the opium of the masses, and it's evil and needs to be eradicated. This is what Stalin said. This is what Mao said. This is what Pol Pot said. And in the name of that theology and ideology, let's put it, millions of people were killed. So their atheism, we've seen it before. We know what did it produce.
Yeah, well, and that's where I make the distinction, however, is, I mean, I'm an atheist, and I don't think these atrocities were committed in the name of atheism. They were committed in the name of anti-theism, and that's what these new atheists are. The Bill Mayers and the Sam Harris and the Richard Dawkins, they aren't atheists. They've hijacked atheism. These guys are anti-theists, and they're no different to what Stalin in Soviet Russia, because they used the same language. Religion is evil, religion is a violence. Religion gives your kids brain damage. All of these type of banal sort of bumper slogans is what the Soviets used. But when that propaganda didn't work, and the Russians continued to believe in religion, that's when they turned to violence.
Absolutely. And look, in the name of if I follow their path, which is Bill Maher path and Sam Harris, we would be in war forever. And we've seen it before. We've seen it before. I mean, I don't want to buy into the same recipes that led to disasters elsewhere. Why would I, would want to believe in a system or in an ideology that opens the door for ongoing wars and produce mass killing before?
Exactly, and the current debate as it pertains to the war on terror at the moment seems to be confined to semantics and linguistics about what to call it. And President Obama, I think rightfully refuses to call it radical Islam. What do you make of this whole political correctness wordplay that Republicans on one side and Democrats on the other are trying to play it here?
I don't think it's about politically correct. It's about understanding the strategy of these extremists. I don't think we should really honor them with the word Islamist extremism. They're common criminals. They're criminals and they're not martyrs. They're criminals and need to be treated as criminals. If you uplift them to the role of he's the Khalif, he's the representative of all Islams, then you're playing into the hands of Al-Qaeda. But also you're saying to Sam Harris and Bill Maher, you're right. So using the right terminology is important, because then you're uplifting these individuals who are basically criminals, not martyrs, and basically thugs who want to impose their views, their backwards views on everybody, who are absolutely anti-pluralistic, puritanical form of Islam that has nothing to do with the Islam I was raised with. And they're imposing them on me as representative of my faith. That is wrong. And that actually, strategically, the best thing to do is to call them as they are. And they are thugs and criminals. And I would call them like that. Because then you make their brand less appealing for others.
Yeah, and that's what Chris Hedges, he says the same thing. He says I just call them gangsters. It's just gangsters.
Absolutely. For me, they're a bunch of thugs and gangsters. And I think President Obama put it eloquently with Fareed Zakaria this Sunday. I mean, they're 0.0 whatever percentage, but you want to give them the stature of representative of an entire faith that incorporate 1.7 billion people. It's just ridiculous.
Yeah, I guess where does this all end up? And this is what, and it comes back to my monologue, I guess. What does victory in the war on terror look like in the end? And if we look at ISIS, I was just listening actually in the car last night I was listening to an interview with Jeremy Shapiro from the Brookings Institute, and he was talking about this big research paper he'd put together on terrorism and particularly ISIS, and he made the point that in the years 06 to '09, ISIS, which originally had begun as Al Qaeda in Iraq, in those 3 years they lost 84% of their membership. Now, let's try and imagine any organization losing all but 16% of its workforce, but somehow ISIS ended up surviving and now thrives. So obviously killing our way to victory in this is never going to get us there. But we keep, continue to talk, in how many troops do we need? Do we need, 2,000? Do we need 50,000? Do we need to take Mosul with a Fallujah type battle? I mean, where does this, ultimately end, or when does it end?
But also look at something, and it shook me. So to conquer Mosul, which is the third largest city in Iraq, it took them. There's, I think,
six weeks.
Yes, but also the numbers. Look at the numbers. There were 30,000 ISIS fighters. Now today between Iraq and Syria. I think there were 800 fighters went into Mosul against, I think, 20,000 Iraqi soldiers. 800. Yeah. These are numbers. So what does that tell you? That they are willing to die for something. And that is their strength somehow. Unlike the Iraqi regular soldiers who are fighting for a sectarian thug like Maliki, who did not want to die for his government, who understood that his government is corrupt. So we need to understand how we can defeat this ideology, not only with weapons. We need to deconstruct the appeal of Al-Qaeda and create an alternative path for young people, whether it's in Syria, that are bombarded today by barrel bombs, by a thuggish criminal regime of Bashar al-Assad, or in Iraq, who, if they are Sunni, is excluded by the Shiite-led government. We have to understand that we need political solutions for very deep issues. And without that, you would be fighting for a generation to come. I think the Pentagon said recently it's 30 years of war. That means I would be in my 70s, you would be in your 60s. It's a tragedy.
That would be my 70s as well.
We will have to think outside of the box in order to defeat this monster. And we can defeat it. It's easily defeatable. The numbers are on our side, but they seem to shape the agenda of the Middle East today. And we have to think, with all of the power that we have, with all of the weapons, with all of the brains, and we can defeat 30,000 thugs? It's just insanity.
So what if you put you on a spot, what would be your three-step solution to bringing about an end to the war on terror?
Look, there's many steps, obviously, but there's the one step that we're avoiding, which is addressing the root of the issue and the grievances of many people that, even though they abhor violence, but somehow they share the same grievances like these jihadists that are fighting with ISIS. For example, if you're a refugee in Syria, a Syrian refugee in Jordan, and ISIS is offering you $600 to go fight with them, and nobody else offering you anything else, obviously you will go fight with ISIS. And this is one of ISIS' appeals. So you need to create an economic opportunities for these refugees outside. The Syrian refugees in Lebanon and the Syrian refugees in Jordan, they're an asset, but they can turn to be a very, it's also a threat somehow, because ISIS can recruit from there easily. They can exploit their economic need. So when you give assistance to these communities, you have to understand that you're not doing a charity. You're doing an investment in your security. This is one side of it. Another side that scares me, these prisons in Egypt, they are a pressure cooker for extremists. So I would push on Sisi to reform, be more inclusive, and stop the crackdown on everybody that oppose him, secular Islamists alike, because that is the next threat is coming from there, coming from refugee camps, from prisons, but also from alienated community around the world. Push in the European community to integrate more. Plus, honestly, we need to do work on the ground, whether it's in Syria, in Lebanon, and stand up to the Saudis and tell them, our allies, friends, stop exporting your ideology, Wahhabism, because this is what produced Al-Qaeda. This is the basic theology behind it. So stop exporting your puritanical, backward ideology that is today creating a space of a civil war, basically, between whoever is Wahhabi and everybody else. So if you are not a Wahhabi, if you are Sunni Shafi'i or Sunni Sufi, you're considered kafir, you're considered an infidel that deserve to be killed. And that is a problem.
Well, where would you rank also solving the Israeli-Palestinian issue?
I would rank it number maybe 1.
Yeah.
And
I'm glad you said that.
I'm talking about core grievances. This is what, you know, when you're humiliating an entire population and enslaving them. And for me, this is one of the disappointment of President Obama, the man that ended the chapter of slavery of this nation, is the man that actually accepting for others 5,000 miles away from here to stay and, you know, to stay as slaves without basic rights under a system that is protected, supported, and enabled by the United States. So that is, for me, one of the core issues that drive extremism, because it tells a story of double standards. It tells a story of how we view others as inferior, how we don't care, and how we are enabling, I would say, a very right-wing, supremacist, extremist government like the Bibi Netanyahu one.
Yeah, I wrote a piece several weeks ago on kind of like dispelling the myth of anti-American sentiment in the Middle East and using polling from Zogby International Polling and shows when you ask, you know, Arab populations in Jordan, Saudi Arabia, UAE, or wherever, you know, how they feel about towards American culture, education, science, technology, and so forth. They all have, you know, all of those issues, all of those elements have really high markers. You know, they're very popular amongst Arab populations.
Yes.
Where opinion falls of the U.S. and, you know, is, you know, 90 to 95% of Arabs are very hostile to the way Americans support Israel and Israel's oppression of the Palestinian people. So it's not America that, you know, the hate is rooted in. It's the hate of specifically, you know, well, it's the policy stupid.
Yes.
You know, and until we you know, deal with Israel in an even-handed manner, you know, we're not going to be able to do anything that, you know, deals with the resentments on which these terrorist groups thrive.
Look at the Pentagon report that George W. Bush commissioned and Rumsfeld actually executed. It tells you a very clear, give you a very clear picture about how the Middle East view United States foreign policy. They abhor, and what drives anti-Americanism in the region is the unconditional support for Israel. So the images of Gaza of last summer, yes, they drove, unfortunately, anti-Semitism in Europe, but they drove also anti-Americanism around the world because, you know, when you see thousands of children slaughtered by state violence and supported by Americans, it shows you one thing, how we live in a world where everything is visible today. You can't violate human rights and think that this will not have an effect. This will absolutely have an effect on driving extremism, and it's a tragedy.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, Rula, this has been, you know, it's been fantastic, and at the risk of offending any of my previous 14 guests on Foreign Object, this has been, for me, the most enlightening. You're such a clear thinker, and particularly on all of these complex issues on the Middle East and there's not enough people that write and talk like you. So I want to, yeah, thank you so much for coming on Foreign Object. Where's your book, Permission to Survive but Not to Thrive?
It's actually, unfortunately, it's only in Italian. I wish I can send you a copy. It's only in Italian. It was printed and it was published in 2006. Yep. And I remember the riots in Paris.
Okay, followed that.
Yeah, but unfortunately, it's only in Italian. I can send you a copy in Italian if.
That's okay. I might have to get Rosetta Stone, and it'll take me a couple of years to read it. But no, thanks. And on Twitter is your what's your Twitter handle?
It's Rula Jebreal. It's at Rula Jebreal.
Great.
My first name, my last name together.
Cool. All right. Thanks so much again, Rula.
Thank you for having me, and you know what? Keep digging. We like that.
Yeah, for sure. Absolutely.
Great.
All right. I'll look forward to seeing you on Twitter again soon.
Me too. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thanks, Rula. Bye-bye.